Alright, when I started this series on comicking, I was intending to do something with a little more production value, a little bit of animation, but what I've realized is I just don't have time to do it that way. So I'm going to put together best quality I can of content, and it's mostly just going to be a lot more simpler, just me and a camera and a microphone. This one is about writing. The steps that I'm trying to go through are the basics, very beginning inception of an idea all the way up to the completion, the drawing, etc., even down to getting things printed, the way that I get books printed. So at this stage we're talking about how to write a comic, how to go from you got your basic idea and then how do you actually get down to pages that have content on them. And this is going to be my methodology, but it's not necessarily one that is shared by others or even necessarily one that's good. You'll have to go and read my work to actually tell me whether or not it's good. And so take this with a grain of salt. But if you would like to purchase comics, I'm sure there's a link below. I think of writing very much like a funnel. It begins with the generalities, and then you end up with something that's extremely precise. You get to that page, and there actually is dialogue written on it. There actually is artwork drawn on it. But the writing is, at first, far more overarching in its intention. So when it comes to the story that I'm putting forth in Theseus, I have the general story mapped out. And this part is very easy for me because I know the basic story beats from adaptation. I only tweak and change the ones that I feel like I would like to tweak and change. I know how the story ends, and I know the basic steps that lead up to it. However, I do not know how things happen. I do not know how they connect to other events, and I don't know how they necessarily relate to how the character is growing throughout the story. All of that stuff has to be populated by me during the process of writing. The way that I do Theseus is chapter by chapter. Each chapter is kind of like an episode. Other than the fact that the chapters have to hit the basic story beats, there's really no requisites in place for them. It can be anything that I want it to be. And so I start with the most basic of parameters. I have a character at a starting point at the beginning of one of these chapters, and then I have a character at an end where something has changed along the way. And so at the beginning of one chapter, I need to figure out either what happened to the previous one or how much time has passed in between and where the character is starting, and then where they end, and the rest of the writing is just filling that space in the middle, helping me get to that point. And so a good example of this would be that in chapter 8 of Theseus, he has just come out of chapter 7 where the Panatheniac games taught him that essentially he was surviving on luck and he wasn't actually putting much effort into anything. And so there's this kind of wrap-up moral that's pushed through on that account. And then when we get to chapter 8, I need him to have learned those lessons and to be moving on to learning something else. And kind of the arc that I decided on for him was that he was going to have to hunt down the Marathonian bull. That's one of the basic events that comes in the story of Theseus. And I was going to use that as a chance to show that he had improved himself significantly in terms of his ability to train, gain discipline, use skills. But the next lesson he needed to learn is how to use this for the good of other people, as opposed to simply for himself or simply for glory, because he's trying to establish himself in the eyes of the people of his kingdom, etc. So knowing that that was my beginning and that was my ending, and this is how it relates to the character all the way through, and the basic setting of this is going to be the Marathonian bull, then I can go through and start to plot out the basic events that would lead up to it. And I find that generally it's a good idea to treat it very much like a map, and to not think too much about the first draft of possible events that take place in that map. And so a map, for me, looks something like this, where I go through and write down each of the particular events that takes place in broad strokes. There's no dialogue, there's nothing like that. It's just what happens and how he reacts to it, leading from the beginning all the way to the end of the chapter. I use a big 18 by 24 newsprint pad, and I just mark out basically how the events flow in, again, the most general terms. I've gone from the hyper general, I know the beginning and the ending, or where we end up at the end, and I know how I want the character to change throughout. Now I'm combining the events and that arc into these little paragraphs that just lead me through the basics. Now, after I have written that out and made changes, usually the first draft is just to give you something to go off of. So, it's going to be a little bit before I move past that point. Instead, I'm going to look at each of the stages, those little paragraphs that I put in describing the story beats that run from beginning to end. And I'm going to think if that's actually the best way to do it. I don't usually think about jokes at this point. I'm writing a comedy, primarily an adventure comedy. I don't usually think about jokes. I have found that jokes are something that kind of emerges from the story rather than dictating the story. So I tend to do those close to the end. Instead, this is very much just kind of raw narrative elements. It's the basic beats of the story. And after I have rearranged those, just brainstormed things out, made tweaks and changes, which I'll talk about that process a little bit later. Then I take it and essentially do the same thing again, but on a page-by-page basis. I know that most of my chapters run between 30 and 40 pages. That's essentially where they come to. That seems to feel really natural. So what I do is I then take that, and on another notepad, I go through and just write in columns, basically. This would be a page. This would be a page, and I'm usually wrong about the first estimation, but this looks like it would basically fit on a page, and I just go through and add additional detail. At this stage, I'm not usually writing dialogue unless it's just a line that pops to mind that I think is very good. It's just what happens on each page. And so I'm not describing specific panels or anything as well, unless something really good comes to mind and I think I'm going to forget that, and then I'll put it down. But we're in this funnel, and we moved about halfway down, and we're getting it more and more formalized, but it is not yet precise. In terms of my writing processes, I have done it over the last 3 years now. When the story really crystallizes for me is when I start drawing the page. And so I don't ever script out a precise description of a page. I go and rough it out to try and get a sense of how that feels. So this whole process of the general to the specific, which is a basic creative process, this is not an invention of mine. It happens at the full story level, happens at the chapter level, happens at the page level, both visual and in writing. You start with a little bit of a beat to work with, and then inside of that I'm going to populate the detail. So you can think about a story as being big folder. You've got the big folder, you got smaller folders in it, and then inside of them each one is a folder. In comics, pages add an additional element that doesn't necessarily exist in every other kind of visual media. The reason why is because you can flip a page over, and there's something significant in doing that. There's a physical motion, so each page, and especially each spread, if I'm holding a book and I've got a spread in front of me, should feel a little bit like a story beat on its own, so that you have smaller beats leading into larger beats leading into larger ones. So I try to think about a page in the same way that I do an overall scene or a chapter. It's got kind of a beginning and an end, and then I'm populating in between, and I want it to land on something of a punch. It can't just be a pure continuation, just stretches over to the next page. I've done it before. I hate doing that. I like it so much better if I can actually make it feel as though it's a landing at that last panel. Best way for me to figure this out is by drawing. It's not by writing. So take a rough pencil and just start hashing out what the page could look like. Again, not thinking about it a whole lot, because the basic principle when you're doing that, when you're brainstorming something out, is that it is a lot easier to evaluate something that you can see versus something that's floating around in your head. So if I have to write out a scene fast, I don't care how bad it is. I can fix it. If I draw out a page really fast, I don't care how bad it is. I can then look at it and say, I see what's not working, and so I can fix it. It gives you greater specificity, so do not sit there and stare at a blank page in writing or in drawing. Draw something and then fix it. That's the basic advice that I give to everyone when it comes to creative work. Do something and then fix it. I do not suggest this if you do something like marble sculpture. Feels like you should probably know what you're doing before you take the chisel. Anyway, so as I rough the page out, once I am happy with the layout of how things run, I'm kind of at the same time figuring out where dialogue would go. And I pencil out the dialogue inside of the page. Once I pencil out that dialogue, I tend to leave it and draw the rest of the page. So I do the page from beginning to end. put in the pencils, the inks, get everything looking nice, and I leave that layer in there with the pencils drawn in and just kind of leave it behind. Pages don't get published online until weeks and weeks after I've drawn them, and so I put it in a folder, forget about it, keep drawing pages, and move on from that point. When the time comes around for me to actually post a page and to put it up on my website before it's ever printed in a book, I will then go in and add the specific dialogue. And I'll look at what I wrote last time, because I will have usually forgotten. I'll look at what I wrote, and I'll typically have a new perspective on it, a better way of phrasing things, which is why I started using this system to begin with. I found that with some time in between, my understanding of what was happening on the page and my conception of how to word things improved. And so that's when I hammer it down to a specific, these word bubbles, these position. And so it's a little bit like the old-fashioned Marvel method. In the Marvel method, Stan Lee would give a basic story to the artist, and then the artist would go and draw the entire comic book. And then they would give it back to Stan Lee, and he would fill in the dialogue based upon their notes and their artwork. I kind of do that with myself. After I've posted it to my website, and this is something that not everybody has the advantage of, I find it extremely helpful. I'll watch in the comments how people react to it. If they get kind of a wrong perception or if they misunderstand the page, it means that I probably didn't put it together as clearly as I thought. Since I usually wait a while before pages end up printed in a book, I go back and I tweak artwork and I tweak dialogue, especially before it goes finally into the book. So my books are always a little different than what gets posted on my website. The good thing about these kinds of changes are they're really small changes. They're not very much at all. And that's where you want to be at this point of the funnel. You don't want to have to be overhauling things entirely, except in the most rare of circumstances. Instead, you want to have gone through the process slowly, hashing out what needs to be hashed out at each stage of the process, so that you're not jumping ahead and finding yourself having to go back and rework something from the ground up. And that's one reason I don't like to have a completely polished script. It just isn't necessary. I can easily stretch it out over the process, and it gives me more time to think about what works and what doesn't. So I feel no pressure at all to have a finished, polished script. And then also, it's nice to be able to spread it out through that funnel, procrastinating certain things until it is time to deal with them. Not getting on them too early, just so that I'll have something that looks polished. Final tips here in writing. Writing is just like every other creative endeavor I've done. It is more benefited by doing than thinking. Usually what's happening when you sit down to draw something, when you sit down to write, is you are going to benefit from all the thinking that you have done in between projects. When you sit down to go, you don't need to sit there and mull over a blank page, whether for drawing or writing. You don't need to spend a lot of time thinking about what to do. You should do the overall scene, whether penciled or written, as fast as you can, and then go back and fix it. Spend a long time fixing it if you have to, but do not sit there and stare at the blank page trying to produce something finished from scratch. To be honest, I don't know that I've ever met somebody for whom that actually works. If there is someone out there for whom that actually works, good for you, but it's not a common experience. So do rather than think. And then in between your project work, read lots of literature and think. It is much easier to analyze something that exists than to analyze something that is in your head. You cannot come up with precise criticism about something that is still abstract thought. It has to be put into a somewhat precise form. And so that means writing things down and sketching things out. The good ideas happen halfway through a process rather than at the very beginning. So do not wait for inspiration. Inspiration does not come to those who wait. It comes to those who do things, and it usually interrupts partway through the process. That has consistently been my experience for quite a long time. And the last one, connection to other human beings is better than self-expression. self-expression is highly overrated. It's really just self-indulgence. We write stories in order to create connections because there's a common human experience. And so one of the most important things in the stuff that I write, as simple and as jovial and as non-great as it is, I'm still trying to create a character that people can connect to, someone who has an arc of virtuous change. He's trying to become a better person throughout the process of the story. That remains interesting to me, and as much as we subvert it or change it or try to come up with alternatives to it, I think that is still the solid foundation of all storytelling throughout human history. And that's what I want to emulate. That's what I want to produce, is something that does that. And I think people connect to it better than they do in just seeing your glorious independent vision and thinking about how clever you are. That's a novelty. It can be fun for a few minutes. I don't think it lasts. I don't think those are the stories that people come back to over and over. They make a splash in the moment, and then they're gone. Or they don't make a splash at all, and then you just feel bad because you feel so vulnerable about all this stuff that you self-expressed. I would rather craft something that is related to the common human experience. It's less about me, and it's more about things that happen in the world that I think is fascinating, interesting. I'm not going to bid to take myself completely out of it anyway. There's going to be something of me in it because it's being produced by me. But I feel no need to prioritize or treasure that aspect. Instead, I try to craft it towards something I hope people will enjoy, and I genuinely hope they will. I hope it's a character that they can find themselves relating to, and I hope it's circumstances that are interesting and fun and genuinely make people laugh. The final piece of writing advice I have is just that, to craft something for other people and to not feel bad about doing that. I think that's the right move the vast majority of the time. I can't think of an exception, but I like to leave the opportunity for an exception. Well, that's pretty much it. That's how I write. And somebody might think that that is the stupidest version of writing in the world, and it easily could be, but I have found it to be very effective. So try it if you like.